Yeah, so we're starting, as we're discussing the word ballo and looking at it, it means to cast or to throw. Seven types of casters, throwers, or noisemakers. The first one, it discusses the multitude, putting money in the treasury. That's the common person. The next one that's discussed are the rich people. That's the wealthy person. The next one that's discussed is the poor widow. That's the poor person. Number 4, right in the middle, as with any other menorah pattern, that seems to be a foundational branch. We'll discuss that at the end. The fifth one, the fifth use of this word, I put down the word inspired, and we'll get to that in a moment. But this is 2 times this woman, this poor person, is described as having put in. But I'm going to put down the word inspired because certainly all of us can be inspired. And where we get our inspiration from is what makes a difference. The next one, it says, and all of the contributors, okay, that's the inspired, they put in out of their surplus. The next one is withholders. And the 7th one, which is she again, out of her poverty put in all she owned. That's the devoted, or in parentheses I put the committed. All she had to rely on. The one right in the middle, though, which is, let me find it here, let me find my stuff. Yeah, it's right in the middle in verse 42. He says, and calling his disciples to him, he said to them, truly I say to you, this poor widow put in. Clearly, and this is a little play on words, clearly this woman was observed. And what I put down on my sheet.
Yeah, I got it. All right, so it's Crackle Day. There we go. Cup order.
I put down the divinely observed, not the divinely disturbed, but the divinely observed. This is the middle. I wasn't exactly sure how else to describe this, but I put down the divinely observed. And what this indicates, really I think goes back to Jordan's video, which is answering the question of how are we living our lives?
I'm sorry, I'll get her address.
When we are delivering our right, when we are bringing into the treasury the things that God has strengthened us with or enabled us with, do we do it as though we believe in Him? Do we act as though we know God exists? In other words, do we realize the simplicity of things like God is sitting on His throne room observing, has the opportunity to observe us right now, this moment, let alone every moment that we find ourselves doing anything? Do we live our lives that way? Do we understand or recognize God's ability to have participation in our lives, to have interaction in who we are and what we're doing? This is why I use the term divinely observed. Do we recognize that there are times when Yeshua could be watching and observing what you are doing and calling disciples to himself to discuss what it is he sees you doing? In his opinion. How are we delivering? How are we giving? What's of ourselves? And I asked a question at the end of this, looking at the way these are put together. It's not necessarily a menorah pattern. I connected them a little bit differently with the different colored lines I put there. Because I think that the last 3 that are listed, are parallel to the first 3 people types that are listed. And I think they do 2 things. I think that the 3 that are mentioned, the last 3, describe both the gift, the blessing, so to speak, or what can also be the curse of that individual. Because not all of us are necessarily common people, not all of us are necessarily wealthy people, and certainly not all of us are poor people. But yet we can each have, as a blessing or a curse, the motivation behind what we do. The common person needs to find inspiration.
I like that word, motivation.
The wealthy person is going to deal and struggle sometimes with withholding. I mean, we have a challenge in us if we have any kind of wealth or gifts. We have a challenge to be a good steward of what God has given us. We have a challenge to make sure that we're a good steward of what God has given us, but we also need to make sure that we're giving at the degree and to the level of what God requires, or what He plans. And so withholding can be an issue. Usually, with poor people, certainly been in my experience, both when I was younger was very poor, and even as an adult as I've had issues, usually with most poor people, you don't find an issue with withholding.
I don't think you've been poor.
Well, physically, yes. Spiritually, no. When I was younger, yeah, we had,
I don't think so.
well, maybe not my age, my generation. Is that what you're referring to, Dave?
I've met very few truly poor persons. Very few. This is a very rich country where the poor have so many things which everybody measures your
Yeah.
poorness by. There are very few truly poor people. The few I've met were pretty happy with where they were at.
Yeah, I can appreciate that.
So we talking monetary or we talking spiritual?
Dave is talking, obviously, physically, with, what he's
Physically,
discussing with the country.
we're in this world as
Yeah.
human beings.
Yeah, compared
Talk
to
about humans.
other situations, this is where either wealthy or poor, right? Those are adverbial words that describe, what is the word I'm looking for? They're admixtures. So they're compared to other terms of wealthy and poor, right? So somebody that feels like they're poor here isn't going to be as poor as in some other place.
When I lived in Mooresville, I had 2 pairs of pants. One was, in fact, both of them were overalls. Overalls.
Can you catch that?
Overalls.
They're made
You know what bib overalls are? That was my favorite clothing, and I had to. So I could change. I could go take a bath and put my clothes in the laundry and go put on the other pair. So I had 2 pairs. I don't know how many you guys grew up with. Maybe a few more, way more than I even had. But I was not poor. If you'd have said I was poor, I would have gone looking for a nickel or a penny or something and pulled it up and showed you. I'm not broke. Although I never considered myself poor.
All right, so at the bottom of this, I asked, which of these categories do you think most of us fall into? I don't know if anybody has any comments before we move on about some of this or about giving, but
We can get you one that adds up.
Yeah, we're working on getting you some ketchup, Dave. I don't think you should be playing all biscuits, though.
Squeeze it, shake it, look into it.
yeah, it's probably.
No, you do it. For me. All right, go ahead.
I'm just wondering, I mean, if anybody else has any comments about this idea, man, how are we, laying before God what is God's, right? I mean, this prefaces and comes right after the Caesar coin parable or the teaching and the story, and how are we presenting what's owed to him? And what are we presenting?
I think it's hard to, other than statements about tithe, which we all understand. I think it's hard to understand though exactly how much God does expect us to case, tithing 10% of my retirement income is no issue. So to me, that makes me feel like, well, he must be expecting more than that. But nothing clearly tells you that. I mean, there's examples where people give everything, and that doesn't make sense to me. That you put yourself into poverty and unable to support yourself by giving everything. But how much you should give. Yeah, should you try to save money for your kids to inherit? Or should that all be going somewhere right now? You know, I struggle with these things all the time.
That's why,
Well, I have that question. Can tithing also maybe include when we're giving our service to God, when we're donating our time to be an usher
Just
or
real
to
ketchup.
do work in the sound booth and to do prison ministry? Can't that be a form of tithe also?
Well, it's part of our giving, that's for sure.
Part of your gifts.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so I've had that discussion and made the statement as we've been covering over this several different times that it does involve all of the skills and talents or the gifts that God has given you. You know, He has every fair expectation that when a gift or when a piece of knowledge about something is installed in something, you have even an expectation for it to function and to work productively. If you all of you, for the most part, have, I'm guessing, owned a computer. And some of you may not be technologically savvy like Arthur over here, but if you've owned a computer, you've installed a program on it with every expectation that that program is going to function within the parameters of what it's intended to do. And it's going to, we all have that expectation. This is what I described as one of those no-brainer things that exist in the natural world because God absolutely, unfortunately, we are just blind oftentimes to the spiritual world. God has every right to have that obligation, that understanding, and expectation over us. When we understand that we've been bought with a price and that we belong to Him, we have to put forth an intentional effort every day to make sure that we remember our life is due to His action. Now, this is not intended, obviously, because He doesn't put chains on us, He doesn't put shackles on us, He doesn't bind us in such a place that we're non-productive. This is something we have to be very intentional to devote ourselves to and be mindful of because He's not trying to enforce something on us as though we're a slave, we're under this. But this is why Paul very intentionally chose to refer to himself as a bondservant. Because there's nothing wrong with recognizing, right, that as you grow, as you mature in life, you have a responsibility to do more, to take care of more. I will share my opinion, and it may not necessarily resonate with all of you, and it may not come from a place of vast knowledge, wisdom, or experience. But to answer Larry's question about what should we really do, I've had a few people in my life that I've had discussions with that have that are somewhat wealthy, that have money or whatnot, and a few individuals that I know in particular have spent the majority of their time and their efforts saving their money and building their money, and in their minds doing what they believe is being a good steward of their money, and having as much opportunity as possible to invoke or to share wisdom with their children about what their children could be or should be doing. But at the same time as their children might be making bad decisions or might be having a tough time or might be struggling financially, the parent watches them go through some of that ordeal, and then on the side sometimes complains, or you can see that they have a hard time because they're not able to spend as much time with, or they're not able to do as much with their grandchildren or their kids as they would like. And my advice is usually the same, that they should maintain and continue doing what they believe is good stewardship, but remember, you're not taking it with you when you go. And yes, setting up a future for your children is important, especially all the more important if they are not as capable of being mindful of the future and setting one up for themselves. But if you can also use part of your wealth while you're here to enjoy your time with them, I encourage people to do that as well.
Should I try to control them to wheel or something,
You're never gonna be able to, I know you know that.
but we can sure try. And,
Some do.
People try.
but
I know.
let's look at this in a physical and spiritual side. Because you can fit into any of these categories depending on your perception of when you do it. If I'm feeling forced to pay 10%, and I'm feeling obligated, at 10%, it means nothing. It means absolutely nothing. As a matter of fact, I don't even think it goes on the account. All right? Because that's not what he wants. He doesn't want and or need your 10%, 12%, 15%, or 20%. He doesn't want to put a percentage on it at all. What he wants you to do is to give and be a cheerful giver out of your heart. So if I'm a cheerful giver of 5% and you're a non-cheerful of 10, hello. What is going to change these and turn them into a gift, a blessing, or a curse? My perception in how I'm giving, how I feel about what I'm giving, not the amount that I'm giving. Well,
That's your motivation, right?
That's your physical, spiritual, and that's what we've been talking about from the very beginning. Is a human side and a spiritual side. All right? And so when you look at that, you have to look at it in both ways. So you're going to be a caster, a thrower, or just a noise maker. So am I going to cast my money at you? Am I going to throw my money at you? Or am I just going to be a noise maker talking about what I should or should not do? And I have to look at it that way.
When we keep track of our 10% that we're supposed to give, is that not hearing that coin go in and clanking? Are we listening for that? Did I give my 10% this week? Did I give my 20% this week? Or did I give my all this week?
There you
You
go.
know, is that within us that we're listening for that clank? Or is someone else listening to that clank?
I'm not sure how to answer you, because I'm not sure what you're necessarily having an issue with. The person who throws their money in because they want to have the most amount of coins and they want to make the most amount of noise when they do it, the problem is with them, right?
Yeah.
The problem isn't with us because we observe that or we see it. It could actually lead us to an inspiration of doing the same thing for a completely different purpose. Giving
There is, I want to make one comment. There is a thought that I had. Sometimes we need to cast or throw and instead of getting close to the treasure, so you're not tempted to reach in and get what you want. Some people have a problem with greed, and so if you're standing up far enough that you just cast it, you're not close enough to reach in and grab.
So in a way that speaks to the expectation, which is part of what we're asking in this too. What is the expectation that is being sown? The first question that we should address, is it wrong to have any expectation? And I want to make sure that we understand the answer to that is no. You should have an expectation, but what that expectation is going to make a difference. Let's talk for a moment about how the word is used in discussing nets. And somebody who has a little bit more knowledge about this can feel free to share something, but some of the things that I know for sure is that you can be trained and educated in how you're going to cast the net out with an expectation of catching fish, and you can also be untrained. And if you just throw the net haphazardly in there, all bundled together and bunched together, your expectations are not going to necessarily be met if they're high, because your yield is not going to meet that. But if you know appropriately how to cast, and if you know appropriately where to sow, then you should expect a different kind of harvest. Does this make sense?
What if my result doesn't meet my expectations?
Of course, my cost.
That's
What they
the
call
result.
it. That's what they call it fishing. They will call it catching.
Yeah.
What if my result doesn't meet my expectations? And where did my expectation come from?
That's an open-ended question. I can't answer that for you. Only you can answer
You
that
brought
for
it
yourself.
up. You opened the door.
I know, but that's the point, is that you're asking a question that's open-ended. It's either negative or positive, and it's all on what you sowed. That was the point that I'm making, is that what you sow is what's going to be the expectation. That's what you're going to yield. So you should always anticipate, you should always have an expectation of what you sow yielding more than what you would think capable, should you be looking towards or trusting in God. If your expectation is that you receive something for yourself and you're upset because you see someone else receive something out of it, then you have something at your root that you need to deal with. If you're sowing seeds in a situation and expecting only for a harvest to grow that's going to feed you, and it feeds other people, and you have a problem with that, then the problem is with you, not with the sowing, not with the harvesting, not with those that are fed by it.
I've got a question. We seem to be talking about both giving to God and giving to man. When we're purposely giving to God, do we really expect something from God? To me, that's wrong. We give to God because we love Him, and we give our unconditional, no requirements, no expectations. I'm giving to God what I feel like I need to give to Him. Now, if I give you $30,000 to help your ministry, then I'm going to expect you to give, to produce $30,000 worth of, we're back. I don't have $30,000 anyway, but still.
I understand, but why?
Why what?
Why would you expect that of me?
I just do. Well, I don't have a reason for what I do. I just do it.
Well, the reason I asked is because we should, I believe, to some degree, have the same expectation of God, or have an expectation of God when we tithe or we give of ourselves into Him. And I don't mean as though we are going to hold Him accountable and He needs to do such and such. What I mean is we should have an understanding that that's what He does. He multiplies, period. When you give Him your love, and when you learn to submit to things around you and love those around you, that is multiplied in your life and the lives of those around you in a multiplicity I can't define. Because that's how God works. God is love. He is light. So when you are entrusting to Him, and you are putting something before Him and allowing Him to breathe through that, you should have an expectation of increase. You may not be able to define it. You may not be able to put your finger on it and say this is exactly what it's going to be. But you should have an anticipation that that's what's going to happen. And that's the exact same expectation you have with me. The problem is I can fail to deliver that. He never does. You understand?
I guess my definition of unconditional is different, because when you give somebody something unconditional, there is no conditions to it. There is no expectations. I'm giving this because I love you. You do with it whatever you want. I might not do that with people, but I do that with God.
I get that, but to me, that term unconditional love has become a real travesty, and I have a real problem with that. It's become a real issue, because absolutely love is conditional, and it absolutely should be. It absolutely should be. You should love innocence and justice enough to know that if somebody is causing pain or is causing an issue intentionally, you know how to do, and you have love for justice, and you have love for other people around enough to do what's necessary. We don't unconditionally just choose to love things of no regard and no responsibility or no accountability. To really, truly love someone is to hold them accountable, to teach them responsibility. When it comes to children, when it comes to other people around us, we have an obligation. God commands us, teach them these things, remind them of these things, tell them these things. We have an obligation to do that. and not in all, but in some homes, many homes unfortunately, I've seen the parentage where they think that unconditional love means just letting the child do whatever it wants and let it learn from its own lessons, and that's just, to me, that's a travesty.
No,
My,
that's not unconditional love. You defined it improperly.
that's what I was gonna say too, because I have an
Or
example.
maybe you don't know what love is. Remember that list I had? Go ahead, I'm sorry.
My son Jeremy, on many occasions, when I was paying his bills for him, I went over and I paid his bills, or gave him the money for it. And the next thing he does was curse me and throw me out of his house. I'm talking about within a 5-minute period.
He showed resentment because of it, right?
No, hang on. My unconditional love did not stop for him. He's my son. I like to think of God thinking of me this way too, because I'm sure there are times he came and he paid my bills and he took care of me. And within a 5-minute period, I cursed him and threw him out of the house. I'm pretty sure I've done that several times in my life. My son did it to me on more than one occasion. He still has a tendency to do that. But through that unconditional love of never throwing him away. See, my dad always said to me, I may not like what you're doing, I may not agree with what you're doing, and I may not support what you're doing. But my children will never walk around with holes in their shoes. I'm going to take you and buy you a pair of shoes. I will give you a place to lay your head. And I will give you food for your belly when you're really hungry. That's unconditional love. Love is not a conditional
I
word.
disagree with that, although I understand the
Well, then
concepts.
we have to
The
agree to
concepts-
disagree.
The concepts are simply trying to say, and the word unconditional, prefacing love, is simply trying to describe that this kind of love I think is greater than another. And that's what love does. It multiplies and it increases. That's all love does. It multiplies and increases. But the fact that for me, other people may not agree, but the fact that I don't agree with you is that very clearly what Jeremy did with you very clearly conditioned you. Because all this time later, you're sitting here talking about it. So the conditions of that environment and situation changed how you love him, because you love him more. Because you see in your life, you did the same thing to God, and you're sitting here using it as a teaching example. It increased your love because the conditions changed. That's my point. The conditions of what happened and the experience of choosing to love and being intentional to love even though these things were happening, the conditions changed. And what I'm trying to say is, when your child tells you, listen, I decided I'm not going to wash the dishes today. Conditions have changed. You don't love them any less, but you're going to love them with a discipline that they aren't going to like. And when that takes place, the conditions have changed again. And when they mature, when they grow, when they evolve because of that level of love. And what I'm trying to say is that too many people look at the term of unconditional love and describe it as being, it doesn't matter what you do, you can do anything you want to me, and I'm still going to love you. That's the wrong thing to say to a child, because now you're giving them a license to just do whatever the hell they want. God doesn't do that with us. He has prepared an expectation of, this is how you live successfully in the land with your neighbor. This is what I expected you to do. I didn't tell you I'm going to love you less because you didn't do it. I'm telling you that you will love yourself, and you'll love your neighbor, and you'll love me when you do these things. And guess what? Those things are conditional environmental changes that impact your life when you do them.
That's the human response to that conditioned, non-conditional. That is classical human response, not godly response, but human response. We all think that way, sort of, one way or another, because we're not going to, you didn't allow your child to continue to be self-destructive. You would start thinking of things to interfere with it, so, and that's what you said. We all tend to think that way. I do too. But I still tell my children, I ask them, what can you do to make me love you more? Nothing. can you do to make me love you less? Nothing. And that's God's love for us. If I can copy that and duplicate that, maybe I've got a chance.
So, the way in which we cast the gifts that we have and the way that we love people, right? This is part of where this whole teaching was going to go, right?
Don't bring judgment,
What does God expect?
right and wrong into love. Because in the list of love meetings, all the things we do, judgment is not one of them. Judging whether your child did something wrong and what action you should take to
Which
correct.
actually brings us to a great question, what makes the temple beautiful?
Yeah, so let's try and get off of page 1 if we can. So going into Mark 13:1, it says, and he was going out of the temple, one of his disciples said to him, Teacher, behold, what wonderful stones and what wonderful buildings. And Yeshua said to him, Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon one another, which will not be torn down. And so I asked these two questions. What makes the temple beautiful? What makes us attractive? Feel free to, invest any answer that you may have. I have a passage of scripture I was going to read for that. But what is it that makes the temple beautiful? I wrote down some additional questions. Is it the stones?
Okay,
It's the stained glass.
I was waiting on your answer.
Is it the stained glass?
I think what makes the temple beautiful is what we give of ourselves unconditionally, with that unconditional love. That's what makes the temple beautiful, because if somebody...
Everybody's going to be stuck on that because we love those terms. Like, we just love that.
Unconditional
love,
but
we just love it.
if you want to make the temple more beautiful, if you try to invest in it and put yourself into it, expecting nothing in return, then you're helping to increase the beauty of the temple.
Your answer was 100% right as far as where, after all the questions that I wrote down, that's my ultimate answer. Is that it's the way in which you go about doing those things. How you choose to invest yourself. Go ahead, Dave.
One thing that's crossed my mind is, what makes the temple beautiful? God.
Yeah, so the questions that I asked here in addition is it the stones? Is it the service performed there? Is it God's blueprints that were designed for it? Is it His Spirit that dwells there? Because if you remember, all these questions that I've asked, those are all things God says in the Scripture about it. His Spirit would dwell there. His robe trains out and goes throughout the entire room. He literally designed the blueprints, telling David that Solomon, his son, would build it, not David. So what is it that makes it beautiful? Again, in the New Testament terminology and time, what is the temple? What does Paul say is a temple now, so to speak? No one's said this yet. Yes, yourself, your body, you. Okay? You know what it is that makes the temple beautiful? It's the way you work in conjunction with those around you to build the building.
I got a question right there, and it is just a general question, okay? When Paul said that, did he say that we as individuals are the temple, or did he say that we are the temple? Meaning
Communally.
a combined lot.
Yeah, communally. So the same idea is echoed. Hopefully this gives us some answer. The same idea is echoed by Peter as well. This is 1 Peter 2, 4 through 10. And coming to him as to a living stone, rejected by men, but choice and precious in the sight of God, you also, as living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house for a holy priesthood to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. For this is contained in Scripture, Behold, I lay in Zion a choice stone, a precious cornerstone, and he who believes in him shall not be disappointed. This precious value then is for you who believe, but for those who disbelieve, the stone which the builders rejected, this became the very cornerstone, and a stone of stumbling and a rock of offense, for they stumbled because they are disobedient to the word. They stumble because they are disobedient to the word. What God has given us to give is His word, His instruction. This is what we're actually supposed to be casting in front of Him for the benefit of those around us. and let me find my place. But you are a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a people for God's own possession, that you may proclaim the excellencies of him who has called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. For you once were not a people, but now you are a people of God. You had not received mercy, but now you have received mercy. We are the living stones being built up into a community. That's part of the key. The way in which we go about performing the service that God commands to be performed in the temple involves us doing it together. The way in which the blueprint plan is to be followed never involves one person standing there looking at it. At minimum, there was one other person that was defined with Moses regularly, repeatedly, all throughout the building of the tabernacle and all the items that would be contained within the tabernacle. That individual's name is Bezalel, which in Hebrew means the onion of God. And this was a man who had multiple layers, like an onion does, who had multiple skills within those layers to be able to do all of the craftsman work that would be needed for the building and construction of a lot of the items. And he literally was the multi-layered man of God, Bezalel, the onion of God, that was given the task of building and accomplishing a lot of these things. Again, this was for Moses to rely on. This is for them to work in conjunction. Many other people were employed for the carrying, the building, the transporting of the utensils. I put down for the second one, what makes us attractive. I put down keeping God's instruction with love toward our neighbor. Sincerity, honesty, truthfulness, love, humility. These are all ways in which we observe, ways in which we display the light of God, the skills, the gifts. What makes us attractive. Keeping God's instruction with love toward our neighbor. Sincerity, honesty, truthfulness, love, humility. I'm sure there's many more we could write down. So there's a question that's going to come up here in verse 3. I'm over on page 81, Mark 13, verse 3. And he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. Peter and James and Andrew were questioning him privately. Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? And Jesus began to say to them. Now I'm going to tell you right now, that oftentimes when we talk about the end times, we're always reminded of the verse that says, no one knows the time or the hour. Only my Father in heaven knows. And Phil's going to sit here and tell you today, and of course this is a generality, I'm using as a plain word, that he discovered in reading through this that I understand when it will happen. It finally dawned on me like a ton of bricks that in this area of them asking the same question that we asked, he gave the answer immediately. And it is displayed in the teaching that I'm trying to give you about, again, what makes the temple beautiful, what makes us attractive. Look at what he says to them. He's sitting in the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. He's just told them that every brick will be torn down. Now, to them that were living in that time, seeing the temple torn down would have been like the end of their culture, the end of their civilization. It could be leading to the end of the world. Anybody who's in a war zone, who's in a wartime territory is experiencing that. They're thinking that when it's taking place. And as he's sitting there, his disciples ask him two questions. When will these things be, and what will the sign be that these things are being fulfilled? I asked, why do we ask, or I put on here, we ask all these questions regularly. Why? I put down the answer, because we love shiny things. Why do we ask these questions ourselves regularly? Because we love shiny things. We love distraction. And he answers them, and I asked, and the way I put these questions is kind of wrong, as opposed to I'm just going to read all three of them and then give you the answer, because it's the same answer for all of them. The questions are, when will these things be? What will be the sign of these? I asked you, does Yeshua answer? The answer is yes. And what is the answer? The answer of when will these things be and what will these signs be is the very first words he speaks. And Yeshua said to them, see to it that no one misleads you. When you are misled, the temple is torn down. When you are misled, your temple, where you dwell in your body, begins to crumble. What is the answer? Build on the correct foundation. That's what I put as the answer. Andy, you look like you're on.
Yeah, and I love that you came up with correct foundation. Yes, please. When I was looking through my stuff this morning, and you know me, I get really nutty and go along with it. But I wondered why was it those four that were questioning him, that were talking to him? Why those four? And so in Mark 13:3 it said, as he was sitting on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple. And I thought, wow, what does that mean? And so I went and looked it up as to what that meant. And the Mount of Olives, mount is a mountain. Of is of. Olives is a fruit. It's in the vines and in the Strong's, it explains an olive as a fruit of that tree, of an olive tree. And that this mountain was full of those. And opposite the temple. And I thought, opposite the temple. So I kind of put that together in my mind, and as I was trying to answer some of these questions. And so when I looked at Peter, it said he's the rock. When I looked at their names all meant something. And they mentioned these four expressly. Peter is a rock or a stone. James is a supplanter, which means to replace, overthrow, and it led me to Jacob, the way Jacob was, because he too was a supplanter. John means Jehovah is a gracious giver, and Andrew is manly.
Is it what?
Manly. Andrew means manly. So when I looked at that, it said that if I went to the mount, it was sitting on the mountain of fruit opposite the sacred place, because it explains the temple as being a sacred place. So how much of the mountain am I sitting on, and the fruit that I'm producing is going to the sacred place? Because it went from there right on into, they were questioning him about these stones. These were four very strong men with a lot of teaching and a lot of learning from him. And yet they're asking him these questions. And he's talking to them about the fruit that they bear or produce in the sacred place. And to me, that went right along with, of course, I had to ask, did you do this spell all and regularly on intentionally? Or was that just a typo? The way you spread them out. But it is about the correct foundation. And my foundation is the fruit that I produce from the mountain that I sit on towards the sacred place. That's why I said that, and that's why I went that far into it, because this is what keeps me from getting misled away. I have to be bearing a process. I know whether or not I'm bearing proper fruit.
You do?
I do. By the results that is happening with other people and those around me. I also know when I'm bearing bad fruit.
But also, another thing that you haven't said is when you're building on the correct foundation, you're also building from your past experience when you was in the dungeon.
Mm-hmm.
And once you have gone through that dung heap, then you can start to look at where you went wrong and build on your correct foundation. Because you've made reference to that many times with how you had to go through your different steps. You have built your correct foundation out of your garbage. And you're using it for God.
Now we're getting somewhere, right?
Has been Holy Spirit that He helped you in doing this? Or did you do it all on your own?
Oh no, he has helped me very much. Matter of fact, he's my guide I think that's what he does, is guide me.
If you listen to him, you'll do it right.
I know where I ended up when I guided me.
I know every time I try to do it completely on my own, it doesn't work.
He do it.
So what is the correct foundation?
Where's that question?
And right underneath it says, does Yeshua answer? I put down yes, and then I put, what is the answer? And what I wrote is, build on the correct foundation. So that's an answer that I gave to what is the answer. Build on the correct foundation. That's how you address not being misled. Build on the correct foundation. So what are examples of a correct foundation? I wrote down love. Grace, truth, justice, righteousness, and instruction. What does God say love is? What does God say grace is? What does he say truth is? Justice, righteousness, and instruction. What does he say about those matters? In Micah, he tells us, what does God expect of you, O man? But to do justice and righteousness. To do them. And in verse 6, Yeshua goes on to say, many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. And I asked the question, who is capable of doing this? What kind of person does it take? What kind of action does it take to mislead others? And here's an answer that's going to seem strange to you, that I'm going to give you. He says, many will come in my name, saying, I am he, and will mislead many. Every single one of us in this room can be that person. Because every single one of us in this room should be going forward saying, I am like Yeshua, with an intention towards trying to be like him as much as we can. Is that not the goal? We are invited to take his yoke upon ourselves and learn from him so that we become like him. We say in our Christianity all the time that accepting Yeshua into your heart and bringing him into your life is the key, is the goal, right? We try and get people to pray this prayer of salvation all the time and absorb him and take him in. So those who have the capacity to come in his name saying, I am he, and mislead people, that can be us. It's not some charlatan up on the screen who owns 20 jets and claims that all you got to do is send him $1,000 a week and he'll get you blessed. That would be too easy. The real charlatan that can mislead is somebody sitting in this room who with very good intentions walks into somebody's life and says something or does something that misleads them. And so I asked, what kind of person does it take? What kind of action does it take? What kind of action does it take to mislead others? And the simple answers I put down, all it requires is ignorance and pridefulness.
Mm-hmm.
That's all it requires for you to mislead someone else, is ignorance and pridefulness.
Reverse them, pridefulness and ignorance.
Yeah. Whatever order you want to put them in, try not to have either one. Ignorance is literally not knowing. If you have ignorance in your life, it's because you don't know. And if you are speaking, or as Jordan Peterson put it, if you are claiming that you manage a responsibility or claiming belief in God and that you can manage that, and you aren't studying, you aren't reading, you aren't walking in the experience of that relationship, you're in ignorance. And we should be very mindful and careful about what subjects or what issues we give advice on should we not possess a combination of experience and perhaps knowledge about that particular area. And we should be humble to recognize whether or not we do. Pridefulness and ego will oftentimes be the driving force behind staying ignorant. I've also put down, I had shared this extra scripture, another scripture I brought with me like Peter earlier. I put down that it is also the kind of action that it takes to mislead others is a failure to walk in, and then I have Psalm 119, verses 162 to 168, which says, this is David writing, he says, I rejoice at thy word. as one who finds great spoil. I hate and despise falsehood, but I love thy Torah. 7 times a day I praise thee because of thy righteous ordinances. Those who love thy law have great peace, and nothing causes them to stumble. I hope for your Yeshua, O Lord, and do thy commandments. My soul keeps thy testimonies, and I love them exceedingly. I keep thy precepts and thy testimonies, for all my ways are before thee. This entire passage covers so many aspects of what we've been talking about. The last thing he says is that he recognizes all of his ways are before God. Do we recognize that with the way we're casting out the gifts he's given us and the skills we're using? Do we recognize that every one of our ways is before him, stands before him? He says, and get this is David writing before Yeshua even walked on the earth. And remember, Yeshua in Hebrew is not only his name, but it's a word that means salvation. So when you see the word salvation in the Old Testament, you can inject his name in there if you want. And David writes, I hope for thy Yeshua, O Lord, and do thy commandments. I do your commandments. Are we doing his commandments while we're waiting on Yeshua? Because we, although we have hindsight to recognize that Yeshua walked on this earth once already, do we not anticipate his return with the same, practically the same fervency that David or anybody else did before he came the first time? We anticipate and we await his coming. And while we hope to see and await the coming of Yeshua, what are we doing? Go ahead, Dave.
Phil, you're a very good teacher. We respect you as that. But when somebody asks each of us, any one of us, what is the reason for your hope and your faith and your belief, we become the teacher. And we must be ready to respond to it. What is the reason for our faith in God? I've had that to happen with my neighbors. She started with the word why, and you can answer the rest of the question. Why does God? And I realized once, just for a few moments there, I was the teacher. So I had to be ready to answer. Right? Is that what he's telling them? Be ready? Preparing them for...
The next section of scripture we're getting into is exactly that. He begins talking to them about end times and what to be prepared for. And that's where I'm trying, the next section is to go into that. How do we prepare ourselves for the pain, the suffering that we would see?
You spoke on the Mount of Olives, and I was thinking, has any of you been there? Somebody tell me.
You mean physically over?
Yeah, seen it?
No,
Well,
I haven't.
it's a big hill. They are not mountains there like we think of mountains. But it's an enormous hill, and you get up halfway on it, and you look out, and you can see all of Jerusalem. All of it. You're up above it, looking down, and this golden dome is pretty obvious to you because it's right there on the mount where the threshing floor used to be. They built up around it so that it's flattened out. It's not a hill anymore. It's just a big raised bed with a big wall around the way around the city. It's enormous. But the view from up there is just fabulous. Because when I was there, both times we stayed in a hotel up on the mountain. So we looked out our window and we could see all of Jerusalem. It's beautiful. We had a lot of pictures up there. Anyway.
I don't know how much more we want to
So
keep going.
where exactly are you at?
What?
Where are you at? Are you down in 13.7 yet?
Ready? I'm just getting ready to start that if we continue.
Okay.
So, is everybody good? Anybody? Okay. So, I'm going to read this whole next section of scripture, and then I just start off by addressing one line of it. But this is him sharing and articulating for them a lot of what to expect, perhaps at end times. And interestingly, not only did a lot of the disciples experience this directly and within just a few years, but it is something that many disciples have continued to experience over the years, over the centuries. So, and some of us may experience some of these same things too. But let me read through this. It says, "And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be frightened. Those things must take place, but that is not yet the end. For nation will arise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes in various places. There will also be famines. These things are merely the beginning of birth pangs. But be on your guard, for they will deliver you to the courts, and you will be flogged in the synagogues. And you will stand before governors and kings for my sake as a testimony to them. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. And when they arrest you and deliver you up, do not be anxious beforehand about what you are to say, but say whatever is given to you in that hour, for it is not you who speak, but it is the Holy Spirit. And brother will deliver brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and have them put to death. And you will be hated by all on account of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, but let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let him who is on the housetop not go down or enter in to get anything out of his house, and let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak." Now, Andy might want to discuss this, and I'm not sure if he might have been looking for it, but I've chosen not to get into much discussion about Daniel and the abomination of desolation. If you'd like to go back to Daniel 7 and read about that, you can. I'm going to spend some time focusing on something different rather than the abomination of desolation right now. I want to look at just the one verse that I put in red in that section, but the one who endures to the end. I want to talk about the word endures. And I shared it as, yes, it is the first verse that I have that here. Now, let me kind of read through. We're at the top of page 82. How do we endure to the end? Here are the things that you should get from all the verses that we'll read through and look at and be able to write on here. I put down we persevere, because this is another meaning for the word endure in Greek. And I did not put what the word is. So, oh yeah, I did. Hupomino. It doesn't just mean to persevere or endure. It also means to stay behind, to await.
To remain.
To stay behind, to await. And so how else do we endure to the end? We persevere, we help one another, we love one another and count no wrongs. I put in there. Dave was talking about that earlier. We study to show ourselves approved. That's a big one. We discipline ourselves to study and serve. One of the very first times that this word meaning to endure is used in the text is Luke 2:43, and look what it says. "And as they were returning after spending a full number of days, the boy Jesus had endured and persevered and stayed behind in Jerusalem, and his parents were unaware of it." And I asked you the question, what is he doing? What was he doing? I'm guessing most of you remember.
Teaching, wasn't
You could say that.
Learning, teaching.
Yeah, and in Hebrew, both learning and teaching are the same word. The word lamed means both, to learn and to teach. He literally is sitting with the Pharisees, amazing them because of how much he knows and understands already.
So that's when he was 12.
And he had intentionally been investing of himself to learn and to study. It's not a requirement for you to be a divine being or to be God himself for you to know and to understand God's heart. God has laid his heart out open and bare for all of us to read and understand and to experience with others, to live out. He was discussing his Father's word in the temple. That's the answer. That's literally what the text tells you when you go and read it later. He was discussing his Father's word in the temple. He even says that to his parents when they ask him, "Where were you? Don't you know how worried we were for you?" "Well, where else do you think I would be but in my Father's house discussing his word?" What else would you expect of him? Hebrews 12:7. uses the same word. It is for endurance that you endure. It is for perseverance that you endure. It is for discipline is the word the translators use. When you discipline yourself, you endure to the end. And what is the verse again? He says in verse 13, and you will be hated by all on account of my name, but the one who endures to the end, he shall be saved. The
Right.
one who disciplines himself to the end shall be saved. That's a crucial understanding.
I came up with a similar yet different. Now, remain, endures means to remain. And I got all this out of Strong. And end, the word end meant a termination. The limit at which a thing ceases to be. Always at the end of some act or state, but not of a period of time. And that's what it came up with. So when I look at that, it's telling me that you're going to be hated by all on account of my name, but the one who remains until this thing ceases to be,
Arthur, I know
he'll
you
be
got it.
saved.
I'll see you soon, brother. All right. I want to make sure that we understand and articulate a difference between just simply remaining, enduring, and discipline. This creates two ideas. I think the two words create two ideas that I want us to have an equal balance of. Just to simply remain and endure means, well, I just go ahead and crouch myself into a fetal position and give them my back, and I tense up and I rock up, and I just go ahead and endure and get through the situation. That's a part of it. And in some cases, that might be what you have to do. You may just have to let them slap you on the other cheek too. But discipline creates a whole nother idea. It means you set forth with an intentional approach towards life that says, when those hard times come, I'll be prepared because I devoted myself in discipline towards doing, towards reading, towards studying, towards putting into practice what was right.
Okay.
I want to make sure we get both sides of that, because one cannot stand without the other, at least in my belief. We can try and give ourselves and treat our backs like leather and let people whip on us all day long, but the only way that you're going to maintain having a thick enough skin is to maintain keeping your nose in the Word, to maintain keeping your nose in the expression of love. Keep yourself intentionally invested in making sure that you display humility, that you display appreciation for what God has given. Romans 12:10-15 uses the word too. I think it's very simply going to make sense. This is, again, how do we endure to the end? This is the question that we asked here. Paul gives a very direct answer to this in this section of Romans. Be devoted to one another in brotherly love. Give preference to one another in honor, not lagging behind in diligence, fervent in spirit, serving the Lord, rejoicing in hope, persevering in tribulation, being disciplined in tribulation, being enduring through tribulation, devoted to prayer, contributing to the needs of the saints, practicing hospitality, bless those who persecute you, bless and curse not, rejoice with those who rejoice, and weep with those who weep. And I think he writes a lot of the same things and gives some parallels to Timothy. That's why I had that verse there. For this reason, endure all things, for the sake of those who are chosen. This is why you have to intentionally discipline yourself, is for the sake of those who are chosen, right? God chooses other people, and sometimes we don't like those people. And sometimes those people don't like us. But God can still choose, and God still can choose to work within those people. We still have to endure, persevere, and discipline ourselves to go through that, so that they may also obtain the salvation which is in Yeshua, and with it eternal glory. It is a trustworthy statement that if we die with him, we shall also live with him. If we disciplined ourselves, if we endure, we shall also reign with him. You cannot be put in a position of authority or expected to reign if you haven't disciplined yourself to learn how to. And you don't discipline yourself in learning how to reign over other people with love and with an appreciation for who God is and the character of God. He's not going to put you in a position to reign over other people if you've not disciplined yourself to learn how to love them. and you've not disciplined yourself to be patient, to be loving, to be encouraging. To reign with him means to have proven yourself through enduring and persevering. And if we deny him, he also denies us. If we are faithless, he remains faithful, for he cannot deny himself. Remind them of these things and solemnly charge them where? In the presence of God. All of these things keep echoing back to this recognition. And this is the reminder, the catalyst that we should have to understanding what it means to be enduring, to be persevering, to be disciplining ourselves, to be putting our minds into that yoke and into the book. We are in the presence of God, not to wrangle about with words which is useless and leads to the ruin of hearers. Be diligent to present yourself approved to God as a workman who does not need to be ashamed, handling accurately the word of truth. This is what we've been equipped with. When we come into the temple treasury, it's his word that we're to be giving back. Getting back into what do we give? Isn't it fascinating to think? We say this about money all the time, right? Well, everything God's given me is his. I mean, whether it's 10% or 15% or 25% that I give, or 50% or 100%. Doesn't matter. He gave it all to me anyway. It's all his. I mean, I know you've all heard that. He's equipped us with so much more, including his word and his spirit by which we keep it. And he has a fair expectation to receive it back from us. And when we come into the temple treasury, what we should be pouring out of our storehouse to give is what he's spoken about. There is nothing greater that we can do for our neighbor than what he's commanded us to do, because it succeeds in helping us live successfully with one another in this land. And so we'll kind of get through this. I don't know if we need to necessarily, if we have time, I'll leave it up to you guys. It's only about 15 minutes long. If we get to the last clip, if we don't want to watch it, that's fine. You guys go right now. Take care, man. Have a good day. There's three things that I pulled out of this section that I just wanted us to earmark. Three things I pulled out of this section. God bless you, brother.
Yeah, God bless you. God bless. God bless.
One common thread that binds all three of these things together in a way that I saw. Three things that I pulled out. Let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him who is in the housetop not go down or enter in to get anything out of his house. Let him who is in the field not turn back to get his cloak. And I can read all the statements that I put on here, but I'll try and find the right words to describe to you what I saw as a common thread through all of these things. And this is a problem that we have all the time.
We need to pray for him.
For Randy? Something in
I think
particular?
he has an illness he's not telling us about.
Well, he has told us he does have some issues with his kidneys and
Yeah.
with his
There's
pacemaker.
much
and all.
worse than he tells you about. He's not asking. Did he have it prepared here?
Not today. Not today. He didn't bring it up, but I know that Sherry's
I
had
talked to
some.
him, and it's a lot of pressure.
I see. Well, I'll reach out to him myself too and see if I can get him to maybe share and allow us to pray over him or something. I wasn't aware if that needed to be done.
And
He
it's
told
just
me
the
that
feeling
they-
I got from talking to him last
They
night.
told me they
That's
put a
it.
hole in his leg to help with the blood vessels somehow, okay?
Jerry does that with oxygen.
Okay.
And they were gonna do it again at another spot.
All right. Well, let's reach out to him at another time. I'm not trying to be disheartened about this, but I don't want to necessarily speak too much of his information on the video. So let's just reach out to him individually and make sure that we do pray for him if we need to.
And one common thread binds all of these things together.
Yeah. So those that are in Judea should flee to the mountains. Let him who is on the housetop not go down to enter in, get anything out of his house. Him in the field not turn back to get his cloak. I'll use whatever words I can come up with to try and describe it. What I see is the common thread is don't wait to the last minute to try and get what you need spiritually, and do not allow yourself to be overcome by physical pleasures or by comforts and ease. Spend the time that you have to now getting to a place where spiritually you are able to do the battle.
Don't be a last minute Christian, huh?
Yeah. When you realize that you have the job, you have the obligation to study and to read, you realize that you're doing it for the sake of the community, for the benefit of those around you. In this lower world, so to speak, like the lower lands of Judea that we live in, for us to be able to flee to the mountains, so to speak, I'm speaking spiritually or using this idea this way, for us to be able to use that knowledge, we have to have built it up. And if you find yourself in the war zone and you haven't done what you need to do in your training to be prepared for that, you're not only harming yourself, but you're harming that company of people that you're going to be with. It's for their benefit, not just your own. It's for your family's benefit that you make sure you're trained up in what you need to know. If you're standing on your housetop and you see the war coming, don't be so preoccupied with the ease of comfort and personal possessions and all these things, and don't be relying so much on those strongholds. Don't be looking so much at these personal things and trying to find for yourself ways in which to comfort yourself as you go through that. Don't be so worried about whether the flesh is going to be cold or it's going to be uncomfortable and you need to go back and get it. I mean, obviously be sensible and do what's necessary to get you through every moment and to get other people through other moments. And obviously getting and making sure that you take with you coats so that your children can be warm if you're going into a cold environment is obviously proven. And it's smart. But don't be waiting to the last minute to prepare those things or to go toward them. So if you guys have the time, the patience this morning, the last little video clip that I wanted to share with you is something else I've come along through with my studies. It is only about 12 minutes long. It is about, it's in the middle of a teaching that Grant Luton, we listened to him last week. It's a teaching that Grant Luton is giving about spiritual strongholds. And he decides to have some discussion about the shofar. And the shofar is the vehicle that is used to sound the alarm of the return of Messiah, we anticipate, right? We expect to hear trumpets blowing upon his return. And the shofar is something that God uses as a weapon to bring down spiritual strongholds. And sometimes the spiritual strongholds that we have in our lives are of our own creation, of our own nature. And rather than me try and articulate what he shares or teaches in this particular message, I just wanted to have prepared for you guys. I don't know, it shouldn't take that long.
Oh my God! I don't know if I would do that.
It's not Jericho, so
We'll find that.
it's just a beautiful, beautiful picture.
All right, let me give you a little bit of. All right, let me give you just a brief background again. He was talking about spiritual strongholds, and he's down in South Africa. This was about a year ago, year and a half ago.
Down where?
South Africa. They recorded his teaching down there, and he was talking about spiritual strongholds and talking about if you had to name a biblical example of a stronghold that was torn down in the scripture, what is the example? And it was Jericho in Joshua chapter 6, I think. And if you remember, the Israelites are told to walk around, and then at a certain time they're told to blow the trumpet or blow the shofar. And he spends some time just discussing the shofar, and I just really felt that this was fitting for our discussion of the gifts that we have, whatever talent it is that we have, whoever it is that we think makes us what we're doing with it. Okay. Down? Yep.
The shofar is God's way. And the battle of Jericho sets the tone for Israel's victories as king. And I know seeing a shofar on the table, would somebody bring that up here? I would like to talk about the shofar. I hope that we do, that you'll never see a shofar the same way again. I was staying with Chris and Ruth, I spent a lot of time down there. They're beautiful little chalet. And, oh, there's some good things there too. When the wall's tall, when it's easy, look for the redeemable, because when every construction is stronghold, when he uses Rahab and her family in there, that God says, this is what's worth, this is the reward. And there's a legend in Judaism that Rahab became Joshua's wife. I don't know if that's true or not. But what a beautiful sentiment that is. Because Joshua, Yeshua, is the same name. And what's the bride of Yeshua like? Sinners, saved by grace. Like as Rahab with faith in this God.
Okay, I just want to tell you this real quick. I've got to tell you at the beginning. Near the end of this, the last minute or so of this, he's going to refer to some things he has on the screen, and that's what those letters are. Okay, so this sheet that I made here that's right in front of Andy, that's what he's going to be referring to that's on their screen that you won't be able to see. And he's talking about those three words or those three things. So I just want you to know that when he gets to the end of that and he's talking about that, that's what it is.
I mean, they might say too. It's just a beautiful, beautiful picture. Beware of salt and glory. Because Ahab, he finally, the Pharaoh took some things and hid it in his tent. And Israel lost their next battle. Then you read on Joshua about that. And then do not rebuild Jericho. If God destroys a stronghold, do not rebuild it. Leave it, destroy it. Okay, so staying in interest Jerusalem chalet, I spent all my time the other day drawing this shofar. Which I know doesn't look nearly as good as the real thing, but anyway, that's my kind of stuff. So I want to talk about the shofar before it was a shofar. Before it was a shofar, there was an animal attached to the end. It wasn't hollow. It was a horn on an animal's head. And where is that? Where's the thickness? Up here. You don't see a horn on a cow's butt or its elbows or knees. It's on the head. And every one of us has a horn that we take pride in. We're always using to shove in people's business. When there's a conversation, people tell things that happen, you've got a story better than theirs. I got to put this story in there so they'll be impressed with me. Maybe it's the way we manipulate people emotionally. Do you do things to make people feel sorry for you? Or try to get people to think that you're better looking, to use your charm to manipulate if you're a lady. Remember, charm is deceitful. Okay? What's the horn in your life? Is it a talent? Maybe it's some musical ability or a writing ability. So you use that to knock people out of the way, and you're better than that. What's the horn in your life you use to charge into people, to insert yourself into people's lives, to draw attention to yourself and show you're stronger, you're better, you're more effective than others? Maybe it's your finances, maybe that's your horn that you rely on. So what is it? What's the horn in your life? Don't think by now, by talking, everybody's thought, what is in your life? So that horn, the one that's inside your head, is called a Karen, which means horn. It's also a word that's translated power. What's the power in your life? What's the care that you rely on? God wants your care. What he wants to do is remove the flesh from that head. He wants you to surrender to him. And when you do, you're not going to like what he does. He's going to hollow it out. He's going to take a sharp point. That organ, the care you used to harm people with, it's gone. You have to think, well, that's one perfectly good world on waste. But instead of you being the power of this sin to push it, he says, I am going to give you power at this sin. And it doesn't have to move anywhere, just stay at rest. Because it's not it moving into the lives of people, it's my breath moving through it instead. And you can drive your horn to the walls of that stronghold, The rest of your life is not going anywhere. With God's breath coming through what's hollowed out in your life, when it's emptied out and it's made safe, he's blended when his breath moves through it, then the works just fall down. You see? How did God bring Adam's body to life? He formed him out of dust of the ground. And how did he bring him to life? He breathed into the nostrils that the shot of life, the breath of life. Now God is taking things you rely on for your strength, for your independence, for your power. Since you surrender to me, I'll breathe a second time. But this time it's to what you on your own free will get to. Let me breathe through that now. And then watch what happens out there. This is what we love to show. Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, we're told to hear the Lord of the Zohar and to remember, to Zachar. This is almost like remember. Well, there's some suggestions. I think the first time we find the word horn in the Bible is when Abraham took his son Isaac up to the top of Mount Moriah to offer him up. And then the angels and then he took it over and there's a ram by his horn, singular, just one. It's not plural, it's horns in most translations. It's only one horn. It shows how Abraham is willing to give up the one thing in his life that would take his name into the future, to have a son finally. He's willing to offer that son to the Lord, and that son Isaac became the father of Jacob, the 12 tribes, eventually Messiah himself. See? So what is the thing you're relying on? That hard thing, that strong thing in your life, that's what we were facing. If you can give that to God, remove the flesh from it, and let His Spirit work instead through it, all the things will happen. The strongholds that seem impermeable fall down. The captives inside the Rahab are set free. Treasure laid out in heaven, the silver, the gold, copper, and bronze, all those things. And what a testimony. What a testimony. And that is the seventh tone for all your victories. This is principle right here. Whenever you show far, remember it used to be this, but now it's this. It used to be the thing that grows through. Now it's God's breath going through it. That's what happens when you surrender the things to God you depend on. It reminds me of Moses. I'll close with this. It reminds me of Moses when he saw a burning bush, right? And he goes up and God gets to speak to him. I want you to go back to Egypt. I want you to set my people free. Tell Pharaoh to let them go. Moses started to look excuses. And God was fine with that for the first couple. We got last and God's ready to slap. But he said, well, they won't believe me. And he asked Moses, what is that in your hand? And Moses said, a mateh. There you see the word mateh. Men-te-he. What is it in your hand? It's a mateh. It's a staff. God said, let it go. See, that's the thing Moses liked. That was his protection. That was his authority. That was his security. That was his care. God said, let it go. Moses did it. And then what happened to it? It became a serpent, a poisonous serpent. Moses fled from it. You know, you can see the strongholds and the powers and things you depend on in your life, what they are, you flee from them. Say, Lord, my life depend on that thing. He'll reveal a serpent inside. But then God tells him to pick it up, not from the head, where you normally pick up serpent, you end up picking up serpents. But the opposite. Just like God takes the care, He says, I'm going to work the opposite. Tells us to pick up my tail, and when he does, it turns back to his staff. Now when you look up here, you see that the first and last letter of staff is all the word ma. What? So God said, what's in your hand? It's a mateh. Oh, what's in the middle? Tet. And the letter tet always represents and pictures a serpent. So the middle of the mateh is the serpent. side, it's not surrender. But when you lay it down, God reveals it, and he says, okay, you have to take it up. From then on, it's not stacked the Lord. From now on, that strength that you rely on is something that God uses by his Spirit in a completely different way. Isn't that what you want? Okay. You have courage to do what needs to be done. The real courage is not Jericho's stronghold. The real courage is, do I have the courage to make a fool of myself by doing things God's way, which looks silly? Do I have courage to surrender to God that the things in my life I depend on? Are you able to trade in what you have faith in and then instead of your faith in it? When you do that, everything changes. Everything changes. And that's what I want for me, my family, for you, and the Messianic community at large. Because I think that's the way we really set ourselves apart. Keeping the commandments is wonderful, it sets you apart, and I tell you what, surrendering our horns so God can make them shofars, that changes the world. That's something that is loud in a way that's going to draw attention from the world. Okay? Well, let's close there. All right.
So dealing with strongholds, man, there's no better way for me to let that point get taught than just to have him do that. So sometimes the things that we hold in our hands, or sometimes the things that we think God's using to give us power, still have a serpent concealed in them, and it's because we haven't submitted them. We haven't laid them down and let go. And when we lay things down and let go of them, or when we refuse to, it's because we have a fear that we won't be allowed to pick it back up again. Sometimes we can't, but we still have to trust him and figure out whether or not he wants us to pick it up again. So hopefully today's Bible study made sense. I wasn't sure we were going to get through to the end of things, but we did.
That sounds great.
Anytime Mark 13 has been in studies, I think it's important to point out that it's not the subject you're pulling out of. But, you know, there in Mark 13 on page 81, you reviewed the end times, the foreshadowing of end times coming from Christ. And one of the things are coming, what is going to happen. And one of the things that I always try to point out to a group is verse 10. And verse 10 tells you it's very clear that the gospel must first be preached to all nations. That's a requirement that's clearly stated before the end times have come. And right now, Mount Gilead, as an example, has 2 missionaries facilities, that are in Papua New Guinea, where there are like 12 tribes that they're trying to slowly translate the Bible so they can communicate in the language those people understand about Christ and to share the gospel with those tribes. And I don't know how many more examples of that there may be left in the world. But, the end times are not going to come until the gospel is first preached to all the nations. That's stated clearly in our Bible. It's something that was, clear from a little kid in Sunday school, was always put into my belief. So since we covered that, and you read it, but you didn't really say much about that because that wasn't the subject you were after.
Yeah.
I want to point that out to you because we went right through those scriptures.
Well, we definitely can't share that without also pointing out that in this generation, we have so much more of the possibility of that taking place than certainly 10 years ago, 100 years ago, or 1,000 years ago what they saw.
Right.
And
You know,
I'm going to go ahead.
Mount Gilead bought a satellite link as an example. You put one of these tribes to speed up the translation. That's being